It's almost unheard of in Yu-Gi-Oh! For a card to be more popular while limited than it is unlimited, all in the span of a couple months. However, in the case of Eradicator Epidemic Virus, the card reached its peak in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Back in early January, and then suddenly once it got unlimited, people just stopped playing it. Now don't get me wrong, it was very popular at YCS Chicago, which was the first event that the card was unlimited, but if you've looked at the recent YCS and regional deck lists, almost no one is playing it. It's actually kind of eerie because people went from citing it as a staple 3 of in pretty much every Danger Thunder Dragon list, and then suddenly they just stopped playing it entirely. I looked at the YCS Atlanta list, the YCS Dusseldorf list, the UDS Las Vegas list, and in all of those situations, basically no one is playing Eradicator after it being so hyped by the vast majority of the competitive community after the release of the January 2019 ban list. So in today's video, I want to talk about the rise and fall of Eradicator Epidemic Virus in the span of just a few short months, starting from January 2019 through present day Yu-Gi-Oh! A lot of times on this channel, I like to talk about the long history of a card, all the different ways that it was used in the past, but in today's video, I'm only focusing on the last couple months because so much has changed in relation to Eradicator Epidemic Virus. Despite the fact that Jesse Cotton didn't actually play any copies of Eradicator in his YCS Sydney second place deck, this is where the Eradicator idea sort of begins. And I mention that because if you look in his side deck for Danger Thunder Dragons, he's playing a specific card to combo with some specific traps. The card that I'm referring to is Nightmare Gryphon, and the traps that he was using were 1 copy of Summon Limit and 1 copy of Imperial Order. Now the reason that he was playing these cards is pretty simple. By playing a ton of dangers and a ton of dark monsters, you can very easily summon Curious, the Lightsworn Link monster, from your extra deck and send one of those trap cards to the graveyard. From there, all you have to do is summon Nightmare Gryphon and make sure it's linked to something, and then you can discard a card to set whatever you sent with Curious to the graveyard. So while Eradicator was not in the side deck of Jesse's second place list, it is worth mentioning that one of the other players using that deck at YCS Sydney was Ryan Levine, and even though he didn't top that event, he did top the next week at the PPG Atlantic City event, and he used a very similar sideboard and very similar main deck to that YCS Sydney build. One of the changes that he made though was that he didn't only play Summon Limit and Imperial Order, he also played the one limited copy of Eradicator Epidemic Virus. More so when he got to that portion of his deck profile where he showed Eradicator, Imperial Order, and Summon Limit alongside Nightmare Gryphon, Ryan Levine, one of the game's best players, even said that that was one of the things that made his deck so much stronger than the other decks in competition. Worth noting then is that that was the last weekend before the January 28th ban list, which eventually made Eradicator unlimited, and very shortly after we had YCS Chicago, which was probably the peak hype for Eradicator as far as modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Goes. Now the reason the card was so hyped is because on the January 28th ban list, many of the cards in the Thunder Dragon deck ended up getting hit. And while it is true that no Thunder Dragon archetype cards made it on that Forbidden and Limited list, many of the cards that Jesse and Ryan Levine used in their builds of Thunder Dragons did make it on that ban list. Things like Brilliant Fusion and Gold Sarcophagus went to 1, and things like Fairytale Snow, which was the linchpin of that deck, ended up getting banned. Therefore, people had to shift their ideas of what Thunder Dragons could be moving forward. More importantly, Skystrikers and Altergeist were the big decks to beat coming out of that ban list because neither of those decks received any direct or indirect hits, so people thought that Eradicator Epidemic Virus was going to be the biggest counter to both those strategies, and on paper, they're right. Both those decks revolve around either spells in the case of Skystrikers or traps in the case of Altergeist, and Eradicator, when it resolves, very often instantly wins you those matchups. And to be fair, at YCS Chicago, which was the very first major event since Eradicator went to 3 copies per deck, it was extremely popular. You saw it in basically every single Thunder Dragon list and every single Danger Thunder Dragon list, and even in Jeff Jones' crazy Danger Zombie list that got 34th, you saw it all over the place, specifically to counter decks like Striker and Altergeist. However, during and after YCS Chicago, I think 3 big issues with Eradicator Epidemic Virus became readily apparent to anyone that played that card in their main or side deck. The first issue is that the card is only good going first, and that is a pretty big issue because when you're thinking of playing a deck like Danger Thunder Dragons or Pure Thunder Dragons against Strikers or Altergeist, the hard part isn't when you go first, it's when you go second and have to play through 5 back row cards and hand traps. What I mean by that is that in the case of Danger Thunder Dragons and regular Thunder Dragons, which were pretty popular at YCS Chicago, most people when you were playing those types of decks would have a pretty decent chance to win when you were going first, even without Eradicator Epidemic virus in the mix. And that means that when you go second, you need stuff to actually deal with your opponent's board, and while in theory maybe Eradicator does that, in practice oftentimes it's not quite good enough, at least not better than cards like Twin Twisters or Red Reboot or Dino Wrestler Pankatops. The second issue with Eradicator is sort of twofold. It not only has a steep cost that requires your opponent to have a very specific hand to be good against, but also it sort of dismantles your own board with bad card economy. It makes it easier for your opponent to come back after you've flipped and resolved the card. Now what I mean by that, because it might sound a little bit crazy, is that yes, Eradicator can be ridiculous against decks that play a lot of spells or traps, but if you've looked at a Striker deck list or you've looked at an Altergeist deck list, you might notice that it's not entirely spells or traps. They still have monsters in there. They still have, in the case of Altergeist, some spells. In the case of Strikers, they have some traps, sometimes strike, sometimes impermanence, and at YCS Chicago, Evenly Matched was actually very popular in the Striker main or side deck. But overall, when you think of Eradicator, realize you are taking a -2 when you use the card. You are not only getting rid of your copy of Eradicator, you are also tributing a card for cost, which means that to break even, you have to destroy at least 3 of the cards on your opponent's hand or side of the field. Going second, your opponent's going to have 6 cards, so with Eradicator, you have to destroy half of their hand to actually make good use of it, and even then, if they have, in the case of Strikers, 1 copy of Ray, which means they can go into Kagari and continue their plays, or in the case of Altergeist, if they just have a Mylusic or a Marionetter to continue their plays, that Eradicator kind of dismantled your own board and allowed your opponent to come back. Obviously, it's a very big effect if your opponent has 6 spells in hand, or 5 spells in hand, or maybe 5 traps in hand, but outside of those situations, if they have a more balanced hand of half monsters and half spells, or half monsters and half traps, the Eradicator doesn't actually quite do enough to warrant the -2 that it takes to summon it. Actually, in many cases, it's better to just leave the Colossus on the board, and obviously as time would go on, people would figure out even better combos to do with Thunder Dragons than just summon Colossus and tribute it with Eradicator. And that brings us to the third and final and probably biggest reason that Eradicator isn't seeing play anymore, and that's this crazy deck that topped YCS Chicago. It got 5th place, and I don't know who made the deck originally. I don't know if it was an entire friend group playing the deck, but I do know that Aaron Furman, one of the game's best players and best combo deck builders, managed to get 5th place with this ridiculous deck that people really hadn't thought of, and that was a Sekka's Light version of Danger Thunder Dragons. Now, Sekka's Light is an incredibly powerful spell card. I've talked about it a few times, but the big thing that it prevents you from doing is activating spells or traps for the rest of the duel outside of Sekka's Light. That means that you basically have to only play monster cards alongside that card, which basically means that you can't also use Eradicator. And when you're comparing a card like Sekka's Light, which is a starter card, an extender card, a card that fixes all your hands, that draws 2 cards, when you compare that to Eradicator, a card that's only good going first against matchups that aren't the mirror match, which suddenly became very popular, you really begin to understand why Sekka's Light became so popular and cards that couldn't be used with it suddenly fell off the map. Things like Eradicator aren't bad cards, but when you're playing Sekka's Light, you don't really want to side that card out going second or going first in games 2 or 3. The main strong aspect of your deck is that it can take advantage of this huge Pot of Greed / Magical Mallet effect, which means when you're looking to side deck with decks that play Sekka's Light, you're looking for monster cards that you can draw with the Sekka's Light. Things like Denko Sekka, things like Dino Wrestler Pankatops, things like Thanos Dragon. Those are all side deck cards that you can play against popular matchups, even Strikers and Altergeist. Obviously not in the case of Thanos Dragon so much against Altergeist, but all of those are pretty good against the other decks of the format, and they allow you to keep the Sekka's Light in your deck, unlike Eradicator Epidemic virus. The other thing that sort of goes along with the shift to people people not playing pure Thunder Dragons and suddenly playing Danger Thunder Dragons is that your going first strategy became so much better. In the case of YC Chicago, people were ending not only on 1 or 2 Colossus, but also ending on things like Hot Red Dragon Archfiend Abyss and Zombie Stein, things that could negate your outs to Thunder Dragon Colossus, which is an incredibly powerful card against Sky Strikers if you have a way to stop their 1 copy of Widowmaker to try to negate it. When we look at a more modern version of Danger Thunder Dragons, they sort of has stopped playing Zombie Stein, and now they make a Morphage Goliath, which turns off your extra deck entirely. So when you're a Thunder Dragon player, when you're a Danger Thunder Dragon player, ignoring the aspect of Sekka's Light, which is very important, just looking at the end boards that you can make. Would you rather end with Eradicator and Colossus, or is it just better to consistently make Goliath, Colossus, and Hot Red Dragon Archfiend Abyss? How does a Sky Striker opponent out that board? I don't really know outside of drawing a specific hand of like Double Evenly Match or Sphere Mode Engage. Those types of very specific outs to that board are really hard to draw, and a lot of times you'll just be able to OTK your opponent before they ever get a chance to react to your board. In other words, it's really cool to play Eradicator and Imperial Order and Summon Limit when you're already playing Curious to send your Fairy Tale Snow to the graveyard. It just gives an already good extra deck monster added utility in games 2 or 3. However, when you're no longer playing Curious to send Snow to the graveyard, suddenly you're only playing the card, if you're playing it at all, to send specific Floodgates to the grave, which only works in games 2 or 3 when you're going first and already draw a pretty good combo hand. So instead of playing sacky cards like Eradicator and inconsistent combos like Curious and Nightmare Griffin, many Danger Thunder Dragon players cut all of those cards entirely in favor of more combo starters and things to help you end on that Goliath, Colossus, Hot Red Dragon Archfiend Abyss field. Lastly, I just want to put at the end of this video, as I sort of try to do whenever I talk about cards that are clearly good, like Eradicator, just not good this format, even though this card isn't topping right now, even though this card isn't common right now, it doesn't mean that it never has a chance of seeing play in the future. It's actually incredibly likely that after Dangers see some hits or Sekka's Light gets hit, which could possibly happen later on, Eradicator suddenly becomes the go-to side deck card to beat Strikers or other decks like them, things like Altergeist that play lots of spells or traps. Eradicator is sort of power crept by other versions of Danger Thunder Dragons right now, and even when you see decks that are siding spells and traps and siding out Sekka's Light, oftentimes they're siding into cards like Twin Twisters or Red Reboot. You really need those high impact cards to break through boards, not something like Eradicator that's only good once you already have a Colossus on the field. Not to mention you also have to have other cards, otherwise you're just going to get rid of your Colossus and have an open board for your opponent to attack for game. Anyway though, hope you guys enjoyed today's discussion video on Eradicator Epidemic Virus. I think it's a really interesting sort of couple months with a card that very clearly was hyped up and then suddenly fell off the map. I'll see you later though. Thanks so much for watching today's video. Goodbye.